I never thought a single Thanksgiving dinner could make me question every memory I had of my own family. But the moment my father looked across the table and said the words, "It's done. The company has been sold," something inside me quietly collapsed before I even understood why. My name is Ethan Carter, and for as long as I can remember, Carter Manufacturing wasn't just a business in our town outside Cleveland, Ohio. It was the backbone of our entire family identity, built by my grandfather, expanded by my father Richard Carter, and always, at least in my mind, destined to be passed down to me. That night, the dining room smelled like roasted turkey and warm spices, the kind of normal American holiday scene you'd expect in a home where everything is supposed to feel safe and predictable. Yet I noticed immediately that something was off, not in the food or the decorations, but in the way my father kept checking the leather folder placed beside his plate, as if it carried more weight than the entire conversation around it. My sister Claire tried to smile through the tension. My mother Margaret kept asking polite questions about timing and details, but my father's answers were unusually brief, carefully chosen, almost rehearsed, like he had already said them somewhere else before arriving here. I remember leaning forward slightly and asking him what he meant by sold, expecting maybe a partial investment deal or a restructuring plan, anything but finality, but he simply nodded once and said the decision had been finalized earlier that week. The words felt too clean for something so permanent, and I found myself searching his face for hesitation, regret, or even doubt. But there was only an expression I had never seen before, calm in a way that felt unfamiliar. It wasn't until later that night, after the dishes were cleared and the house had settled into that heavy post-dinner silence, that I noticed the folder had been left behind on the kitchen counter. Something about it pulled me in, not curiosity exactly, but a growing sense that the conversation at the table had not been the full story. I opened it expecting legal summaries or financial statements, but what I found instead was a signed agreement dated several weeks earlier, and as I scanned the pages my attention locked onto one detail that made my stomach tighten in a way I couldn't immediately explain: the signature line bearing my name. I stood there frozen under the soft kitchen light, reading it again and again because the signature looked almost right, close enough to be convincing to anyone who didn't know me well, yet wrong in the subtle rhythm of how I actually write my initials, and the realization hit slowly, like a delayed echo, that I had never seen this document before in my life. My hands went still as the noise of the dinner earlier replayed in fragments inside my head, every calm answer my father had given now taking on a different shape, every silence feeling heavier in hindsight. I didn't confront anyone that night, and I didn't go back to the dining room. Instead, I stood there in the quiet kitchen holding pages that suggested a version of my life had already been decided without my awareness. And for the first time, I understood that the conversation at Thanksgiving dinner had not been the beginning of the story, but only the moment I had finally been allowed to hear part of it. I did not sleep that night, not because I was angry, but because my mind kept returning to that document on the kitchen counter and the unsettling way my name appeared on a decision I never agreed to. And by morning the house felt different, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of what had been revealed. My father Richard Carter was already awake when I came downstairs, sitting at the same dining table where everything had been announced the night before, holding a cup of coffee as if nothing unusual had happened. And when he looked at me, there was no surprise, only a calmness that made it harder to speak. I placed the folder on the table in front of him without saying a word at first, and I watched his eyes shift down to it for a brief moment before returning to me, as if he had already prepared for this exact moment long before I walked into the room. My voice came out quieter than I expected when I asked him why my signature appeared on a legal agreement I had never seen, and he leaned back slightly, exhaling as though I had asked a question he no longer felt the need to avoid. He told me the process had been handled through legal representation and that everything had been structured for efficiency, using words like authorization and standard procedure, but none of it matched the way my life had always been explained to me growing up. I told him I had never authorized anything, and that is when he said something that stayed with me far longer than I expected, that sometimes decisions are made for the stability of the family, not the comfort of one person. And in that moment I realized he was not speaking about a misunderstanding, he was speaking about a conclusion. My sister Claire came into the room halfway through the conversation, still half dressed for the morning, sensing immediately that something was wrong. and she looked between us without speaking at first, until I told her about the document, and I saw the confusion in her face shift into something closer to disbelief. She said she had never heard anything about a sale, not even a hint, and for the first time my father's expression changed slightly, not into guilt, but into something more guarded, as if the presence of another witness had altered how much he was willing to say. He told us both that the company had been struggling more than anyone at the table realized, that financial pressure had built up quietly over the past years, and that certain decisions had to be made before the situation became irreversible. But every explanation felt like it belonged to a conversation that had happened somewhere we were not invited to attend. I kept thinking about all the years I had worked summers in that building, stacking inventory boxes in 90-degree Fahrenheit warehouses in Detroit suburbs, listening to employees talk about how the company was a family business in more than just name. And now it felt like I had been part of a story whose ending had already been written without my input. Claire asked him directly if there was anything left for me, anything at all, and the silence that followed was long enough that I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen behind us, a sound that suddenly felt too normal for what was being discussed. My father finally said that everything had been divided according to the agreement, and that the priority had been ensuring the company survived in some form, even if that meant personal expectations had to be set aside. And I remember realizing that he was not avoiding the truth. He genuinely believed this was the only version of the truth that mattered. I left the table shortly after that, not because the conversation was over, but because staying any longer would have meant pretending I accepted an explanation that did not match what I had seen with my own eyes. And as I stepped outside into the cold Ohio air, I understood that whatever had happened at that dinner was not an ending. It was the first visible crack in something far larger than I had ever imagined. I spent the next 2 days trying to convince myself that there had to be something I was missing, some misunderstanding buried inside legal language that I had not fully understood. But the more I reread the documents, the more it became clear that the sale of Carter Manufacturing had not been a sudden decision at all, but the result of a process that had been unfolding quietly for months without my knowledge. I returned to the office building in Cleveland where the company still operated, expecting at least a sense of familiarity, but the atmosphere inside felt different, not because the people had changed, but because the conversation stopped slightly when I walked past, as if everyone already knew a version of the story that I had not yet been told. One of the senior managers, a man named Robert Hayes who had worked with my father for more than a decade, invited me into his office under the pretense of reviewing operational notes, but I could tell almost immediately that he was carefully choosing his words. He confirmed that negotiations with outside investors had been ongoing for months, and that confidentiality agreements had been in place for all executive-level discussions, which explained why I had been excluded without anyone needing to say it directly. I asked him if he knew anything about my name appearing on legal documents, and he hesitated just long enough for me to understand that the answer was more complicated than a simple yes or no. He told me that the final structure of the agreement had been handled through external legal counsel, and that changes were made to ensure continuity of ownership transition. But when I pressed further, he avoided eye contact and said that some parts of the deal were outside his responsibility. Leaving the office that day, I felt like I was walking through a place that no longer recognized me in the same way I had always recognized it, even though nothing visible had changed. That night, I met Claire at a small diner outside the city, the kind of place open late where truck drivers and night workers gathered, and she looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. She told me she had tried calling our father multiple times, but he had only responded with short messages saying that everything was under control and that there was nothing left to discuss. Claire admitted she had started looking through old family records and financial statements she could find, trying to understand how something this large could have happened without either of us being involved, and what she found only raised more questions than answers. There were references to restructuring plans going back nearly 18 months, subtle shifts in ownership percentages, and consulting fees that suggested outside influence far earlier than we had been aware of. As she spoke, I kept thinking about every family dinner, every conversation where business had been mentioned casually, and how none of those moments had ever hinted at something this significant unfolding in the background. When I asked her if she believed our father had intentionally hidden this from us, she paused for a long time before saying that she did not think it was about hiding, but about control, about deciding who needed to know what and when, as if information itself was something that could be managed like inventory. I left the diner later that night with a growing sense that the story I had believed about our family and the company was only one version among several, and that somewhere between loyalty, survival, and secrecy, decisions had been made that had permanently shifted the foundation of everything I thought I understood. I thought the hardest part would be accepting that the company was gone, but what I did not expect was how quickly the silence after the sale would feel heavier than the announcement itself, as if the absence of information was now replacing the business itself. It had been nearly a week since Thanksgiving, and Carter Manufacturing was still operating in name only, with transition teams arriving and leaving the building in Cleveland like visitors passing through a space that no longer belonged to any of us. I returned one afternoon to retrieve personal items from my old office, expecting it to feel nostalgic or even comforting. But instead I found that most of my desk had already been cleared, with labeled boxes stacked neatly, as if my presence there had already been reduced to a record of inventory. A new administrative coordinator informed me politely that access to certain internal systems had been restricted due to ownership transfer protocols, and the way she said it made it clear that this was not personal, even though it felt deeply personal to me. I asked her if she could confirm when the final transfer of ownership officially took place, and she referred me to legal counsel without hesitation, which told me everything I needed to know about how far removed I now was from decisions that once felt central to my life. Later that same day, I met Claire again, and she showed me something she had not shared before, a series of email headers she had managed to retrieve from an archived account that referenced early-stage negotiations with a private investment group based in Chicago. The emails were carefully worded, full of formal language about strategic repositioning and long-term sustainability, but what stood out to both of us was the timeline, because the earliest message dated back to a period when our father had still been attending family dinners and speaking about future expansion plans as if nothing was changing. Claire said she could not understand how someone could live two versions of a life at the same time, one where everything was stable and another where everything was already being dismantled behind closed doors. I did not have an answer for her, because I was beginning to realize that the most unsettling part was not the sale itself, but the possibility that trust inside our family had been structured in layers we were never meant to see. That evening I drove past the company building again, not to go inside, but simply to sit across the street and observe it from a distance, and I noticed for the first time that the lights in certain offices were already different, brighter in some areas and dimmer in others, as if the building itself was being slowly rewritten. My phone rang while I was still sitting there, and when I saw my father's name on the screen, I hesitated before answering, unsure whether I wanted clarity or distance more. His voice was calm, almost routine, and he asked if I had settled into understanding the situation better, as if this were a process of adjustment rather than a fracture. I told him I had seen the documents and the timeline, and there was a long pause before he responded that sometimes timing decisions are made to protect people from uncertainty rather than to exclude them. I asked him directly why I had not been told anything, and he said that involvement creates conflict, and conflict can destroy outcomes that are meant to preserve stability. There was no anger in his tone, only certainty, and that certainty felt more difficult to challenge than any argument I could have prepared. When the call ended, I remained in the car for a long time, staring at the building that had once represented everything I thought my future was built on, realizing that what had changed was not only ownership, but the boundaries of what I believed I was allowed to know about my own life. I stopped going into the office after that night, not because I was told not to, but because every time I considered walking through those doors, I felt like I would be stepping into a version of my life where I no longer had a defined place, and that uncertainty was harder to face than any confrontation. Instead, I began spending my days trying to reconstruct the timeline that had led to everything falling apart. Sitting in my apartment in Cleveland with printed documents, emails Claire had forwarded me, and handwritten notes that I kept rearranging as if a different order might reveal a clearer truth. Claire and I started meeting almost every day, usually in quiet places away from family or company spaces, and what we discovered together began to form a pattern that neither of us wanted to fully accept. There were repeated references to outside consultation firms, financial restructuring advisors, and legal review sessions that had been occurring long before the Thanksgiving dinner, sometimes scheduled weeks apart, but clearly part of the same continuous process. Claire pointed out that our father had always been meticulous about transparency in public business matters, which made the absence of communication with us feel less like oversight and more like intentional separation. One afternoon, she brought me a printed summary of shareholder adjustments that showed gradual redistribution of controlling interest over time. And when I saw the numbers laid out so clearly, I felt a strange disconnection, as if I was reading about a company that had once belonged to my family, but was no longer connected to the version of reality I had been living in. I asked Claire if she thought there was any chance we were misunderstanding the context, and she shook her head slowly, saying that misunderstanding required missing information, but what we were seeing looked more like information being deliberately segmented. That phrase stayed with me long after she left that day. A few days later, I received a message from Robert Hayes asking if I would be willing to meet in person, not at the office, but at a small conference space downtown Cleveland that he said was no longer under company control. When I arrived, he was already seated at a table with a folder in front of him, and he looked more tired than I remembered, as if he had been carrying the weight of information he was not sure he was allowed to share. He did not begin with small talk. Instead, he immediately acknowledged that my position in the company structure had changed prior to the sale and that certain internal adjustments had been implemented quietly to prevent operational disruption. I asked him directly when those adjustments had been made, and he hesitated before saying that the process had begun more than a year earlier, during a period when the company had been exploring multiple strategic scenarios under external advisory guidance. When I asked him why I was never informed, he lowered his voice and said that some stakeholders believed limiting internal awareness would reduce emotional interference in decision-making processes. Hearing that made something in me go quiet, not because I agreed, but because I realized that from their perspective, my exclusion had been categorized as a functional decision rather than a personal one. After the meeting, I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine, thinking about how easily language like efficiency and stability could be used to describe something that felt, from my perspective, like removal from my own future. That night, I told Claire everything Robert had said, and for the first time she did not immediately try to analyze it or compare it to documents. She just listened, then said quietly that if all of this had been planned for over a year, then the moment at Thanksgiving had never been the beginning of anything. It had only been the moment we were finally allowed to see the outcome of decisions already completed long before we were aware they existed. I began to notice something shifting not only in the company, but in how people spoke about it, as if everyone who had once worked at Carter Manufacturing was now carefully adjusting their language to match a new reality that I had not yet fully stepped into. Conversations with former colleagues became shorter, more cautious, and often ended with vague references to legal restrictions or transitional protocols that they could not discuss in detail. And each time that happened, I felt the same quiet separation growing between what I knew and what I was allowed to know. Claire and I continued comparing every piece of information we could find, and the more we connected the timeline, the more it became clear that the structure of ownership had been gradually redefined through a series of incremental steps that were never presented as final decisions in isolation, but instead as small adjustments that only made sense when viewed together as a long-term sequence. One evening, Claire called me and told me she had found something new, an archived internal memo referencing a governance review committee that had been formed quietly to evaluate leadership continuity, and my name appeared in the documentation not as a participant, but as an individual whose role was categorized as non-essential to strategic execution. Hearing that phrase made me stop walking while I was outside, because it reduced everything I had ever done in that company to a classification I had never seen before. I asked her who had approved such categorization, and she said the memo listed external advisors alongside senior executive signatures, including our father, which created a contradiction that neither of us could immediately resolve. That night, I tried to call my father again, not to argue, but simply to understand the reasoning behind decisions that now seemed to exist across multiple layers of authority, but he did not answer, and instead I received a short message stating that he was unavailable due to ongoing transition obligations. The formality of the message felt distant in a way that made it difficult to interpret emotional intent, and I realized that even communication between us had begun to adopt the same structured tone as the documents we had been reading. A few days later, Claire insisted we visit the office archive room, a space that still existed but was now being overseen by third-party administrative staff. And after some negotiation, we were allowed limited access to historical records under supervision. Inside, the atmosphere was quiet and controlled, with rows of labeled storage boxes and digital terminals that required authorization codes we no longer possessed. While reviewing older files, Claire discovered a set of board meeting summaries that outlined risk scenarios involving leadership dependency and ownership transition planning, and as I read through them, I began to understand that what we had experienced was not a single decision event, but a layered restructuring philosophy that prioritized continuity over individual inclusion. There was a section that discussed communication containment strategies, describing how limiting early disclosure to non-decision-making stakeholders could reduce operational disruption during major transitions. And I remember sitting there staring at those words, trying to reconcile them with the reality of my own exclusion. When we left the archive, Claire said that she felt like we were reading about a company that had always been preparing to function without us, even while we believed we were part of its future. Driving back through Cleveland that evening, I noticed how ordinary everything looked outside the car window. People leaving work, traffic lights changing, storefronts glowing softly in the early evening light. And I found myself thinking that the most difficult part was not what had been taken, but the realization that it had been decided long before we ever had the chance to question it. I met Daniel Reed for the first time on a cold morning in downtown Cleveland, in a small conference room that felt intentionally neutral, as if it had been designed to hold conversations without leaving emotional traces behind. He introduced himself simply as a legal advisor who had been involved in multiple stages of Carter Manufacturing's restructuring process, and the way he spoke immediately made it clear that he was accustomed to explaining complex decisions in a way that minimized emotional interpretation. Claire sat beside me, silent but alert, while I asked him directly what role he had played in the sale of the company and why my involvement had been excluded from every major decision point. He opened a folder in front of him and began by clarifying that the process we were referring to had not been a single transaction, but a multi-phase transition plan that had been designed to preserve operational continuity under changing market conditions. He explained that individuals within the organization were evaluated based on their functional integration into long-term strategic outcomes, and that these evaluations influenced how information was distributed internally during sensitive periods. I asked him if that meant I had been deliberately left out of critical discussions, and he responded by saying that exclusion was not the intended framing, but rather selective engagement based on governance structure. Claire interrupted at that point, asking how a person could be part of a family-owned company for their entire life and still be categorized as selectively engaged, and Daniel paused before responding that family ownership and operational governance often functioned as separate systems within the same organization. Hearing that made the room feel colder, not because of anything emotional being expressed, but because of how detached the explanation was from the way we had always understood our place in the company. I pressed further and asked if my father had personally approved these classifications, and Daniel confirmed that senior executive authorization was required at multiple stages, including final approval for structural designation changes. That confirmation landed heavily, not because it revealed something entirely new, but because it removed the remaining possibility that my father had been unaware of how far the separation had extended. After the meeting, Claire and I walked outside into the winter air without speaking for several minutes, and when she finally did, she said that it felt like we had been treated as internal variables in a system we thought we were co-building. I did not respond immediately because I was still processing the idea that every role I believed I had earned through years of work might have been defined differently in documents I was never shown. Later that evening, I tried calling my father again, and this time he answered after several rings. His voice sounded tired but controlled, and before I could speak, he said he assumed I had questions about what I had learned. I told him I did, and I asked him directly if he had known that I was classified as non-essential to the company's strategic future. There was a long pause before he responded that classifications were administrative tools, not personal judgments, and that they were necessary for making difficult decisions during uncertain periods. I asked him if he ever considered how it would feel to be excluded from decisions that define my future, and he replied that sometimes leadership requires making choices that protect the whole system, even if not every individual perspective can be included. His tone did not change throughout the conversation, and that consistency made it harder for me to separate explanation from acceptance. When the call ended, I realized that I was no longer trying to understand what had happened at Thanksgiving or in the weeks before it, but instead trying to understand how something so structured and deliberate could exist inside a space I had always believed was built on trust. I stopped trying to interpret the situation through emotion and started focusing only on facts, because emotion no longer seemed to produce any clarity, only exhaustion, and the more I separated myself from how I felt, the more I began to see how systematically everything around Carter Manufacturing had been structured. Claire and I spent another week compiling every piece of information we could access, building a timeline that stretched further back than either of us had initially realized. And what emerged was not a single decision point, but a continuous sequence of evaluations, reviews, and adjustments that had been operating in parallel with our everyday understanding of the company. One afternoon, Claire came to my apartment carrying a printed document she had retrieved through a former colleague, and she placed it on my table without saying anything at first. It was a governance summary that outlined leadership continuity protocols, and within it there were references to contingency planning for scenarios involving ownership transition without full stakeholder alignment. As I read through it, I noticed repeated terminology about operational stability thresholds and decision efficiency frameworks, language that treated human roles as components within a larger system of risk management. Claire said she could not understand how we had lived so close to all of this without seeing it, and I told her that we had seen it, just not in its complete form, only fragments that were always presented as unrelated administrative updates. Later that day, we decided to go back to the neighborhood where our father still lived, not to confront him directly, but to observe whether anything in his daily routine reflected the changes that had reshaped our understanding of everything else. When we arrived, he was outside in the driveway, reviewing papers on a tablet, and when he saw us, he did not appear surprised, only briefly acknowledging our presence before continuing what he was doing as if he had already anticipated the visit. Claire asked him if there was anything left that we were still not being told, and he responded calmly that transparency had limits when processes were ongoing, and that premature disclosure could create instability in both personal and operational contexts. I asked him if he understood how it felt to discover that my role in the company had been evaluated and categorized without my knowledge, and he said that evaluation was not personal but structural, designed to ensure long-term resilience of the organization. Hearing him speak that way while standing in a familiar residential setting made the contrast between family life and corporate logic feel more pronounced than ever before. Claire pressed him further, asking if there had ever been a moment where he considered including us in the process, and he paused for a long time before saying that inclusion would have changed the nature of decision-making and potentially compromised outcomes that were meant to preserve the company. I asked him directly if he believed preserving the company was more important than preserving trust within the family, and for the first time, he did not respond immediately. When he finally spoke, he said that sometimes those two things cannot be aligned, and difficult decisions require prioritization. There was no anger in his voice, no hesitation, only a certainty that made it difficult to challenge without feeling as though the conversation itself was already resolved from his perspective. Claire turned away, slightly after hearing that, and I could tell she was trying to process something that no longer fit into the way she had understood our family for her entire life. As we walked back to the car, I realized that what had changed most was not the ownership of the company or even the distribution of responsibility, but the realization that the framework governing those decisions had always existed in a form we were never fully allowed to see. And now that we had glimpsed it, there was no simple way to return to the version of reality we had once believed was complete. I did not expect clarity to come from confrontation, but from exhaustion, because after weeks of reviewing documents, meetings, and conversations that all pointed toward the same structured reality, I reached a point where there was nothing left to reinterpret, only information that had already settled into place. Claire and I stopped trying to reconstruct meaning and instead focused on accepting what the timeline had already confirmed, that Carter Manufacturing had been guided through a long and deliberate transition process in which our roles had been gradually redefined without our awareness. The final confirmation came in the form of a formal summary report that Claire obtained through one of her remaining professional contacts, and when she handed it to me, neither of us spoke for several minutes. It was a closing document that outlined the completion of ownership transfer, final governance restructuring, and post-transition operational stabilization, written in the same neutral language we had seen before, but this time there was no ambiguity left to interpret. I remember sitting at my kitchen table reading it slowly, realizing that every conversation, every meeting, and every delayed explanation had been leading toward this single point of completion. Claire said she could not decide whether she felt angry or simply distant, and I told her that I no longer thought those were separate reactions, because at a certain point emotional categories stopped matching the structure of what had actually happened. A few days later, I returned to Cleveland one last time to walk through the area near the company building, not to enter it, but to see it as it existed after the transition had fully settled. The signage had already been updated, and the flow of people moving in and out of the building felt different, more aligned with an organization that had completed a transition rather than one still undergoing it. I stood across the street for a long time, thinking about how much of my identity had been tied to a place that had continued operating according to rules I had never been fully included in. That afternoon, I received a final message from my father asking if I had come to terms with everything that had happened, and for a moment I considered not responding at all, but instead I called him. When he answered, there was a long silence before either of us spoke, and when I finally asked him if this was always going to end this way, he said that he had done what he believed was necessary to preserve stability and ensure continuity beyond individual expectations. I told him that I understood the logic but not the absence of inclusion, and he replied that inclusion had never been compatible with the type of transition they were managing. There was no argument left between us, only an acknowledgement that we were describing the same events from fundamentally different positions of understanding. After the call ended, I remained in my car for a long time, watching people pass by on the street as if nothing significant had changed in the world around them, and I realized that from their perspective, nothing had changed at all. Claire joined me later that evening, and we sat together without speaking for a while before she said that maybe the most difficult truth was not the loss of the company, but the realization that the structure behind it had always existed independently of our belief in it. I did not respond immediately, because I understood that she was right, and that what we had experienced was not a sudden rupture, but the moment we were finally allowed to see a system that had been functioning long before we ever thought to question it, leaving us to decide how to move forward in a world that no longer matched the story we had once believed was our own.